Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Pablo, for the invitation. Thank you very much for the whole, it's exciting to be here for the fourth time in this network. I've been gaining a lot from the interaction with these people, meeting a whole lot of people. And I'm happy kind of to start thinking about launching this meeting. And really, as Pablo said, they asked us a very loose question about how do we see the future. I really don't know. I'm not a futurist. I went to try and figure out whether we know what the future is, whether there is a common sense, or whether maybe there are multiple futures. And I thought that an interesting source is a whole batch of reports and documents that have come out over the last year or two. At the core of the discussion will be three reports. It will be the World Bank, The Changing Nature of Work from 2018. It will be the new OECD Employment Outlook from 2019. And it will be the ILO Work for a Brighter Future. It's very different documents. The ILO document is more of a manifesto, very ideological. The OECD is very, very detailed. But I also looked at other documents such as the G20 Labor and Employment Ministers meeting. There are NGOs reports, think tanks, there are ancillary issues such as the European Commission Social Pillars materials, the UN ECOSOC, and Sustainable Development Goals. So trying to go through these materials and particularly focusing on the three core, I want to point out three messages for this opening discussion. First, surprisingly, overcoming the divide between the Washington Consensus and the Geneva Consensus, I think there is one narrative here. There is one leading narrative that somehow all of these reports are converging around, and I find that very interesting. Point two, despite this convergence, if you read between the lines, or not too much between the lines, the divergence continues, and the World Bank speaks in very different terms than the OECD or the ILO, and I would like to point that out. And the third question is, what does all of this have to do with labor law? So what is the future of labor law that we can derive from these reports? So I'll start with the convergence and then move on. So a few points about convergence. The first is that these are all technology-driven reports, except maybe for Oxfam that starts with inequality. All of these reports start with technology. And an interesting thing about it is I think that in all of these reports, talking about artificial intelligence and about the Internet of Things and about moving to G5 and everything, technology is exogenous. Meaning the question that we asked 20, 30, 40 years ago, and I think about Shoshana Zuboff and The Age of the Machine, who shapes the development of technology? What's the role of business in the development of technology? That's out of the question. Technology is happening. It's kind of like the machine of the God that is leading the way. From technology interacts with things that we already know. It interacts with globalization, with the fissuring of the corporation and industrial organization, with horizontal coordination rather than vertical coordination, with the global environmental crisis, but it only interacts with them. The main protagonist in all of these reports is technological change. And then what do we find? We find A, technology is good, it leads to growth, it will lead to the development of the economy. B, it's going to lead to displacement. And in the gap between the positive thing and the problem of displacement, what we're going to see is inequality. And inequality, everyone admits, is a problem. That's kind of like the end of the whole process. So this is the fundamentals of the story about technology. Technology will lead to two things. One is the end of work, and the other is the changing nature of work. And we'll start with the first. The end of work raises the question of the jobless future and of displacement, people who will not have work anymore. This is something that is not really totally new. We can go back to Fritz Lang, dystopian Metropolis, and the constant fear in every technological change in the past about technology and we lose jobs. But yes, there is a concern. This picture is from the New Yorker, March 2019 with a brilliant long article on how our robots are going to replace us on the jobs. So there is a big concern. The reports are actually quite consistent about it. They succeeded in converging on nailing the job loss precisely between 5 to 60%. They got it right. And they admit that they don't really know, because we know how many jobs are going to get lost. We don't know how many jobs are going to be created, like in all previous technological advances. And in addition, we have to figure out, we know that cashiers in supermarket is a job that is going to be gone. But a lot of the people who are now in elementary school are going to work in jobs where we don't even know what's the title of the job and how we will describe it in 20 years. So it's really difficult to figure it out. So there is a sense that there will be a job loss. Kind of the median estimate is around 15% job loss and 35% of the jobs that are going to be affected. And when we're talking about jobs going to be affected, what are we talking about? Again, it's things that we all know and that we've all discussed, and we've discussed them in previous conferences here as well. Tasks are not going to be regular. Any task that can be routinized is going to be removed over to robots. So tasks will be changing during the job. There will be much less irregularity during the job. There will be more transitions from one job to another, and from employment into unemployment, and from employment into training. So it's the things that we talked about in transitional labor markets 15 or 20 years ago, only kind of on steroids. Time, anything that has to be with standard time ideas is going to change. Place, people are going to work from home, they're going to work from hubs, they're going to work from a different country. Much bigger fragmentation in terms of who is the employer, no sense of employer. We're also talking that technology will replace management and not only the workers. And I think that the major issue here is the question of responsibility. In traditional labor law, we had the idea that the employer is responsible for the employees. And if we don't know who the employer is, or if there will be many employers, or if employers are changing all the time, that means that we don't have a clear idea of the term of responsibility, which I think is really the underlying question for in the future. And what we do know is that there's going to be much more irregularity, and this irregularity is the new informalization. Because a lot of the policy, all of these reports agree that we must make informal more formal, which is a contested idea. But what they all admit is that all of the jobs are going to become, in a sense, more informal as they become irregular. From here, we start seeing a discussion that actually really starts to converge, and I took this from the IMF, for example. The IMF 2018 says, we find statistically significant, economically large and robust negative effect of deregulation on the labor share on the market. I mean, there is an admission that something went wrong in the past. So convergence, point number 2 about convergence is that we have a substantive idea about what should be done. First and foremost, we have to improve the markets. Markets are good and we need to improve the markets. And this is mostly a supply-side driven agenda. And there are 4 important things here. Education, 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 and the World Bank adds health. Why is it health? Because if the workers are not healthy, they cannot be productive. But the idea of education runs throughout all of these things. We need to make the workers more adaptive to the labor market, and what kind of education, and that's important for us as professors in universities. What we're doing is wrong. You don't need to learn the details. People can get the details by themselves. What you need is advanced cognitive skills, general human capital skills. You need social behavioral skills, and that's something that some professors know how to provide and some to a lesser extent. We need skills, coordination between different type of skills, and we need adaptability. And that's the idea that we have a general toolkit that we can change all the time. What do we know about the demand side? Well, we don't know how to create jobs, because we don't know how much jobs we will need to create, but we do know that, very important, all of these reports, decent work ILO. Decent work has become, in the same way that the 4 fundamental core labor standards 10 years ago started to become something that every code will say, decent work is something that every report now will say. ILO's decent work. And that's a comprehensive agenda. So we're looking for good jobs, we're looking for making the informal into more formal. So that will be on the demand side, but it's primarily a supply side agenda. The second thing, we need to bring back the state, and the state plays here a prominent role. And it's about regulating the labor market, it's about ensuring against social risks, and it's improving the fiscal basis. And this is probably the only place where really multinationals play an important part. There is an admission that the multinationals are playing with their taxes, and we need to fund all this education, and health as well. And for that, we need to expand the fiscal base. We don't need to increase taxes, but we need to somehow capture these multinationals. And the third point of convergence here, trade unions are important. Now, the fact that the ILO says that, and unfortunately only about 2 pages of the report says that, but the fact that the World Bank says that, and it feels like they're really kind of feeling apologetic about saying that, but they're saying that. And the OECD is following the employment outlook from 2018, stating that trade unions are essential. And I think that's really an important point that we have to bear in mind. So the finale of the second point of convergence is that we have this idea. At the basic, we have some kind of secured income for everyone, whether they're employees, whether they're independent workers, whether they're working inside the labor market, outside the labor market, whether they're unemployed without a job, with a job, retired, and that would be some kind of a basic income. And all the reports talk about basic income. Some say, well, you know, it will be really hard to get there. ILO puts it at the front of its agenda. But there is an idea out there that people are talking about this crazy thing about basic income. And beyond that, mandated social insurance and extending mandated social insurance and nudging people to increase their savings and labor market regulation for everyone. And this is the joint image that we get from all of these reports. I don't think any of the reports really undermine this idea. And the third point of convergence, very shortly, this is the development of the idea of international law and international norms. You don't read one report by itself. The fact that the World Bank refers to the ILO's decent work, the fact that the OECD refers to the G20 commitment to promote decent work in platform economy, the fact that the G20 refer to Sustainable Development Goals, and the Sustainable Development Goals refer to ILO conventions. It's this incremental joint effort that is building this one narrative that we're starting to see. And I think this is really incredible. Point 2, there is divergence. And it's not really that all of these institutions have become one and the same. Look, for example, at the World Bank. The World Bank is a report about human capital. And accidentally, human capital is something that human beings do, but it's about human capital. So human capital complements physical capital in the production process, and it is an important input to technological innovation and long-run growth. And the major output of this report is a human capital index, in which you measure human capital and you see what are the outputs. Then you can kind of run a regression and see what would be the outputs for productivity or for growth. But it's all about the human capital. So if we're saying labor is not a commodity, no, this is really the essence of the new commodification of labor. The ILO, of course, speak in the opposite language. Our human-centered agenda is forward-looking and focuses on developing the human capabilities needed to thrive in carbon-neutral digital age. It is not about adjusting people to fit into this landscape. It's about fitting the landscape to accommodate the people. So that's the opposite. And where does the OECD stand here? The OECD wants to give you the we're going to please everyone, and this is a win-win agenda, so it's basically the business case. Not only in terms of equity objectives, but also on efficiency ground. So what's good for equity is good for efficiency, and vice versa, and therefore we can actually get everyone together on the bandwagon here. So the divergence persists, even though we do have this core of a shared narrative. So what is the implication here for labor law? And I would like to give you 3 scenarios. The first is not mentioned in any of these reports, but as sad as I am to say it, some mornings I wake up with a scenario. And that's the scenario of despair. The second is let's rewrite labor law altogether from scratch. And the third is LLRN 15, in 20-something years from now. And happily, there are a lot of young people here who will attend LLRN 15. We're going to do the same thing, and we're going to talk about the same topics, and the titles of the sessions are going to look the same thing, and it's all good. Who is the employee, who is the employer? So what is the latent? I always think about Alan Hyde. I don't know if he's here. I haven't seen him yet. He has this chapter, this beautiful chapter in the idea of labor law, where he says, they asked for another idea of labor law, but this time I went around, I looked around, I went down to the cellar, and this time there was nothing, really, really nothing. So thanks, Alan. I kind of think about this chapter. What's the problem with these reports and with this beautiful narrative? It's like 20 years ago, all of these reports would have started with globalization. But now that we got globalization sorted out, now that we know how to deal with migration, now that we know what's a good international trade agreement, now that we are fine about getting the jobs back from Mexico into the United States, now that everything is, we know what's being a good cosmopolitan, now we can move ahead to technology. There's no right-wing populism. And suddenly the state is here at the center. I thought that over the last 20 years we had this Danny Roderick trilemma, will the state continue to exist in our labor textbooks? And suddenly we expect the state to do everything. Social protection and basic income and everything. And of course the migrants will always find a nice state that would like to accommodate them. I don't see how that happens. And more generally, the whole question of political economy, how do we get from here to there? So the OECD tries to give a whole lot of nice vignettes and anecdotes of nice experiments that are happening, but are we seeing here a systematic move toward these circles of social protection? And is it sufficient that the OECD will say that this is a win-win because equity and efficiency go together so everyone will see the light and see that happening? So there's this term now, and it's very loose. It's just transition. At the beginning, it was about combining labor and environmental issues, but the G20 now is using just transition into the new technology. So what is a just transition? I don't know. Sounds very vague. Social dialogue. Everyone says that trade unions are really crucial for the future of labor law. I think that's wonderful. Everyone mentions that there are less members and less coverage of collective agreements nowadays than in the past. So how do we get from here to there? And how do we get trade unions back on the bandwagon? And here in the conference, there will be all kind of nice things the trade unions are doing with the gig economy, with atypical workers, with migrants. Is that systematic enough in order to say the trade unions have a serious role? And how do we change the code? And how do we change the norms that trade unions are actually going to be a crucial component? We know a lot of time comprehensive agendas are not adopted, and what I'm starting to see now in articles is that let's adopt part of it. We'll take it step by step. And the part that people like to adopt is the supply side agenda. Let's send everyone out to education. And once they have education, we can blame them if they didn't succeed in the labor market. And that will be kind of the workfare on steroids is the future. You know, with trade unions, well, we had a good comment, but it didn't work. You know, the membership is going down. So at least let's send everyone to education, and they'll have retraining and on-the-job training and primary education, but then they're on their own. There is no mention in these reports of community. There is no mention in this report on how we actually create a new sense of solidarity. There is a whole lot of soft law, pep talk, encouragement, data collection, and I'm thinking about Alan Supio of regulating by numbers. Maybe we want to regulate by numbers because we're not truly sure that we have a sense of how to go about this. So this is the scenario of despair. Second scenario, and that's one which prevails. Labor laws, we know it will gradually disappear. Actually, what we want to see is the Danish model. You can dismiss everyone, but the state will be out there, and we're actually shifting the labor law research network will be redesignated as the Social Security Research Network. And basically, the idea here is about universality. Let's stop asking who is an employee and who is an independent worker. Every person who uses work, labor, provides services should have vacation days, should have sabbatical days, should have retraining opportunities, should have basic income, and the entry gate into labor law through the title of I am an employee and you are responsible because you are the employer, that should gradually disappear. So some of the suggestions are incremental, some of them are mild, but the idea is go universal. And everyone should have these basic social rights. So it should not be labor law as we know it. And the third scenario, and this is kind of like from the OECD. So first of all, we ask, are you an employee? If you're not an employee, are you seriously not an employee, or is this bogus all kind of bogus arrangements? And then there is a gray zone in the middle, and what we should do is reduce the gray zone, and then we should have 5 panels asking, how to reduce the gray zone? Are Uber drivers, I think Uber drivers is so Amsterdam. You know, LLRN too, everyone talked about Uber drivers. Uber drivers now seems to be an easy issue, actually. There are more challenging ones. And it's a good thing. You know, within 4 years, you know, Uber was, oh, we don't know how to deal with Uber. Now we do know how to deal with Uber, or we have a sense that we know how to deal with Uber. And 4 years is quite a quick time of adjustment for labor law. So we'll play around with the gray zone, and the OECD recommends to reduce the gray zone, and that's fine. And we'll ask all kind of questions. You know, how do we improve the classifications, how we perfect markets, no compete, covenants not to compete are no good, that we know, minimum compensation for everyone, time regulation, we need to change time regulation. Everyone admits that we don't have a clue how to go about it, but that means that we need to work harder here, and that's our mission, and that's what we should do. So these are 3 scenarios. What is the scenario of choice? Well, this is the time for you to decide. We have despair, we have reinventing labor law, we have constant reshuffling. This is the beginning of a conference. I hope you didn't fall asleep. How many people here vote for despair? You have to vote. Okay, a handful. How many people vote for reinventing labor law? And how many people vote for constant reshuffling? Okay. So the most people here go for the constant reshuffling. This is maybe also a way for us to entrench our status and the importance of what we're doing. I thank you for listening, and I hope that we're going to have a great conference today. Thanks.